I was scrolling Twitter recently when I came across this tweet. I love how the media spent decades queer-coding villains in an attempt to scare kids away from being gay, but all they really managed was producing a generation of well, ignore the last part, but in all seriousness, there's some merit to the notion of queer-coding villains as a means to quote-unquote scare kids away from being gay. This idea got me retroactively thinking about the films I was raised with and how nearly every villain I could possibly think of was subtly or not so subtly queer-coded. Of course, that's not a particularly great pattern to pick up on, and it really brings with it quite a few more often negative insinuations of not only what it looks like to be queer, but what it means to be queer. So let's get into why this happened, how this happened, and what the heck this means for the examples given, but also for the future of representation in film and media. Because while this trope began as a product of homophobia and censorship, it still prevails today across nearly every genre, despite the abandonment of the previous censorship guidelines. And while things have certainly improved as modernity has progressed and societal tolerance has broadened, things are still far from 100% solved, and these tropes continue to affect the public's perception of queer identity alongside queer individuals' perceptions of themselves. Well, actually, before we can get into all of that, we must first understand what the term queer coding actually means. And for the sake of this video, I'm going to define queer coding as when a character or scene is written or acted as queer, but either cannot be or is not explicitly queer. That might be for censorship reasons, but as you can see, queer coding relies heavily on subtext to imply a character's identity without ever fully revealing it. But unlike subtext, queer coding is usually intentional in order to associate queerness with other traits. However, unlike queer baiting, this is not done as a means to draw in queer audiences, and is instead done more for the intention of stereotyping certain queer-associated traits. These are the characters that never explicitly divulge their identity, but they can't help but set off your gaydar anyways. These characters partake in queer tropes or stereotypes either in their physical appearance, this might be through makeup or costume, in their behavior, personality, dialogue, or their narrative arc. So this might be who they affiliate with or who they are obsessed with. Or, it might be all three, as is the case with many of the coming examples. Male characters who are queer-coded may behave more flamboyantly or more feminine, and when compounding this with their villainy, it insinuates that their lack of masculinity is inherent to their deviance and evilness. Similarly, female characters who are queer-coded may behave in a more standoffish, more masculine way, which when compounded with their villainy suggests that their lack of soft femininity is directly related to their immorality and evilness. As we'll see through the examples provided, this is often intentional in the filmmaking process to put forth certain ideas of what it means to be queer, what it looks like to be queer, and how that may be tied to other character traits, archetypes, and morals. So back to the tweet. As you might notice, this tweet insinuates that queer-coding villains has been a decades-long intentional process with the sole intention of quote-unquote scaring kids away from being gay. This thoughtfully provokes the question not only of why this happened, but how they managed to get away with it. Well, the answer is actually simpler than you might expect, because it can all be tied back to one dude. Well, in the early days of cinema, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the widespread public perception of queer people was that they were unnatural, sick, or disturbed, and therefore a danger and threat to others. It was also around this time, in March 1930, that the first attempt at film censorship in the US was introduced by Will H. Hays. The Motion Picture Production Code, also commonly referred to as the Hays Code due to the creator, was a collection of 36 rules and guidelines given to film producers to follow that banned certain risque topics from the big screen that were considered by religious groups to be unsavory or morally corrupt. The goal was that this would hopefully ensure that studios were putting forth pure and moral cinema. And in all honesty, this wasn't the absolute worst thing. Cinema was still in its infancy and therefore a process of trial and error. And when looking at some of the items in Will Hays' list, a few of them kind of make sense, like banning explicit images of violence, banning detailed crime, and banning sexual assault. But then again, there were topics that fell into a more subjective gray area because the code also stipulated that so-called quote-unquote immoral topics like sexual perversion, which not only referred to homosexuality, but also any behavior deviating from the perceived traditional concepts of romance, sex, and gender, could no longer be explicitly portrayed on screen unless it was in an obviously negative context that explicitly showed how this behavior was either sinful or dangerous. Therefore, enter the queer-coded villain. Now, this isn't particularly surprising, because historically, monsters in literature and media have been used as reflections for real fears in society, like reconciling differences in race, gender, and sexuality. So, demonizing queer people, something the early 20th century was already super anxious about, was unfortunately easy. Therefore, these villains usually challenge traditional gender roles and the heteronormative nuclear family in the same way queer people might have been perceived to threaten the traditional expectations of gender or sexuality. The Hays Code subsequently shifted storytelling in film, especially queer narratives. Positive depictions of divergence from heterosexuality or traditional heteronormative gender roles were no longer allowed, in favor of solidifying and affirming heteronormative narratives. As a result, any divergence from traditional heteronormative practices was automatically associated with immorality and evil, hence why so many villains and personifications of evil held queer traits, stereotypes, and qualities. But beyond this, these queer-coded villains tend to fall into a few subcategories that we'll look at shortly. So, luckily, the Hays Code was abandoned in 1968 because it was super dumb, which allowed the introduction of more sympathetic queer characters. However, that didn't mean that queer-coded villains and homophobia were immediately eradicated. In fact, storytelling practices that were normalized during the reign of the Hays Code are still prevalent today across all genres, and poorly written queer-coded villains still pop up from time to time. That being said, a lot has changed since 1930, and that's where things get complicated, because while I've just set up queer-coding villains to be a terrible practice, which it largely is, there are a few exceptions, and some of these characters are kinda awesome. So now that the history is mostly out of the way, let's look at a few examples of subsections of the queer-coded villain from the last few decades and explore what makes some of them offensive and what makes some of them weirdly badass. A sissy villain, while evil, still contains the capacity for sensitivity, because after all, the hero must be capable of conquering the villain and prevailing in the end. This character must still maintain gray morality and ambiguous gender presentation and sexuality, however, because the audience is still meant to view the sissy villain as other, and entirely separate from the hero. Great examples of this trope that you might be familiar with include Him from the 1998 series The Powerpuff Girls, and Team Rocket from the Pokemon franchise. Both Him and Team Rocket are clumsy, less-than-genius evil geniuses who somehow manage to be outsmarted by actual children every single episode, which emphasizes not only how incapable and weak they are, but also how powerful and cool the heroes are. And both of them share a refusal to perform masculinity or femininity in any kind of discernible way, further emphasizing their ambiguity and sensitivity, which makes them easier to beat. As mentioned earlier, popular social stigma against men presenting femininity and quote-unquote unmanliness encouraged a tendency in media to assign effeminate traits to villains, which brings me to my next example. Labyrinth is a fantasy film that centers on the protagonist Sarah's quest to save her baby brother from Jareth the Goblin King. Jareth, played by David Bowie, is another example of the sissy villain trope, but he's interesting because this film came out nearly 20 years after the Hays Code was abandoned, so it can't be simply explained away by censorship. Not only does he wear makeup, have a glam rock wig, and flamboyant costume full of tight pants, dramatic flowing silk, and heeled boots, but we see that time and time again his gender-bending persona and sensitive anti-masculine quote-unquote queer qualities are both what makes him a confusingly effective manipulator, but also what allows the heroine Sarah to ultimately outsmart him. The fact that Sarah, a teenage girl, can outsmart Jareth further exacerbates his quote-unquote unmasculine qualities. The fact they pick somebody like Bowie for the role, known for playing with gender expression, further solidifies the character's inherent queerness. By using Bowie, Jareth becomes a chameleon, shifting between evil, dangerous goblin and charming, glamorous rock and roll superstar. It is this shift away from traditional gender roles that allows him to be successful as an antagonist, suggesting that his departure and deviance from masculinity are directly related to his evilness and villainy. While we can read Jareth in a heteronormative lens, considering the film documents his obsession with Sarah, a young girl, his physical appearance still rejects gender conformity and traditional masculinity, instead favoring flamboyancy and feminine charm, which inherently associates him with deviancy and otherness. As mentioned previously in the description of the Hays Code, under censorship, if a character was to be same-gender attracted or transgender, they would need to be either brutally killed or presented as morally corrupted, or hell, why not both? This brings us to our next category of This trope is, pretty bad. Coinciding with society's fears that queer people were physically different and therefore dangerous, this trope takes it a step further to postulate that homosexuality and diverging from traditional heteronormative gender roles was the gateway to insanity, and therefore made queer people capable of committing terrible crimes, and even serial murder. Yeah, I'm not even gonna try to rationalize that one. Regardless, the cross-dressing killer trope is rooted in transphobia, and insinuates that cross-dressers, transgendered individuals, and more subliminally drag queens are all capable of sinister secrets, as it is often revealed that these characters are transgender or cross-dressers at the same time we find out that they are also capable of brutal torture or murder. This insinuates a connection between the two identities, and suggests that cross-dressing is to be associated with the perverse, mentally ill, and the psychotic. But this brings us to a few more examples.
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
So here's where things get complicated, because Rocky Horror came out after the Hays Code era, and the film's queer-coded villain, Frankenfurter, is actually framed as sympathetic at times. However, the Rocky Horror Picture Show walks a fine line between embracing queer identity and exploiting it, and Frankenfurter's character still falls into the cross-dressing killer stereotype after all. The Rocky Horror Picture Show is a sci-fi horror film that follows the main couple Brad and Janet, just a pair of wholesome, all-American, mid-century stereotypes of innocent newlyweds. That is, until they get a flat tire in a spooky forest and have no choice but to ask for help at the nearest spooky, foreboding castle, Upon entering, it turns out that the castle happens to be home to a group of sexually liberated, gender-fluid aliens, but, you know. From here, the film quickly devolves into a wonderful sci-fi horror mashup that simultaneously delves into deep social and psychological issues like questioning your sexuality, questioning your gender, and pushing the boundaries of what can be expected from a heterosexual monogamous relationship. While Brad and Janet serve as the protagonists, it could be argued that the main character of the film is Frankenfurter, the embodiment of the queer-coded villain. However, it's Frank's all-encompassing embracement of his queerness that makes things complicated, because he's actually very charming. That's not to say he's not a deeply flawed individual by any means. In fact, Frank is actually a cruel, selfish, abusive, violent rapist and murderer. Not only this, but again, we see that Frank is physically other. It wasn't enough just to make him not human, he's literally from outer space. But again, Frankenfurter is framed not only as an antagonist to the heteronormative Brad and Janet, but also as a sympathetic main character. Throughout the course of the film, Frankenfurter helps shift Brad and Janet away from their traditional views of sex, albeit a little bit through rape, but I digress, and opens them up to the possibility that sex can be also for pleasure, a novel concept rarely depicted in film in the early 1970s. And in the end, when we see Frank betrayed by one of his own and on the verge of death, we feel genuinely bad for him. Even Brad and Janet shed a few tears. This isn't to say that he isn't without fault, but Frankenfurter isn't necessarily bad representation. In fact, he plays a key role in Brad and Janet's self-actualization, in which Brad ends up questioning his traditional male gender roles and finds himself instead embracing his capacity of attraction to men and affinity for cross-dressing. Similarly, Frank directly helps Janet push the boundaries of the traditional role of docile housewife and embrace a more sexually liberated persona who takes ownership over and embraces her body. Now, discussing self-exploration and playing with gender expression was a huge deal for 1975, but perhaps because the Hays Code was no longer looming over the creative process, and the creator of the musical, Richard O'Brien, self-identifies as third gender, that could explain why the representation is more nuanced and this film comes across so earnestly. Animation affords filmmakers something unique, because almost anything is possible in illustrated character and costume design. However, even in animation, villains continue to fall into the queer-coded villain trope, regardless. So let's pivot a bit and look at Disney. Because Disney has been around since the early 1920s, they're plenty familiar with the Hays Code, and their villains certainly show it. Whew, it's hard not to pick up on a pattern here. Well, some of these might be a little more intentional than you might think, as evidenced by Ursula from The Little Mermaid. According to the academic article by Adelia Brown of Mount Holyoke College and published in the Maxey Journal from Johns Hopkins University, Ursula from The Little Mermaid, for example, was actually purposefully based on and modeled after a famous drag queen, Divine. Co-director John Musker, who helped to design Ursula, explicitly stated that he really tried to get some of Divine's big, campy, overweight diva across in the character. Her movement also resembles Divine's, as she shakes her hips and sachets through purple mood lighting reminiscent of a drag show.
And don't underestimate the importance of body language.
Just from the short clip alone, the parallels between how she moves and uses exaggerated body language is very clear. But there are also parallels in her speech as well. Her speech resembles that of a drag persona.
They weren't kidding when they called me, well, a witch.
Therefore, we can start to see how queer-coding Ursula serves to associate her villainy with her drag persona. Brown further states, showing Ursula, a masculine character, don a more feminine appearance for the purpose of evil, connects cross-dressing and drag with evil intentions. She laughs maniacally as she transforms, emphasizing the villainy of dressing up as a feminine woman. Even the name Vanessa, given to Ursula's more conventionally feminine appearance, is derived from the Latin word vanitas, meaning vanity, which could further associate drag queens with shallow, power-hungry divas intent on tearing down other attractive women. Brown also comments on how Ursula breaks up heterosexual couples. Her example victims in Poor Unfortunate Souls include a conventional heterosexual couple that she corrupts. This reflects the way she tries to separate Ariel and Prince Eric. Ursula consistently fights against the positive ideal of heterosexual romance, and when her disguise dissolves at the wedding, she turns back into her masculine self, with rolls of fat bursting out of the wedding dress. A bigger masculine character emerging from a feminine dress resembles a negative perception of drag queens, and the dark lighting and horrified reactions portray the behavior as evil. The wedding in particular also emphasizes Ursula's corruption of the heterosexual union. Ursula does not simply fight against the heroes, she fights against their heterosexual family structures. This positions her queerness as inherent to and part of her villainy. As if this formal character analysis doesn't already demonstrate how queer-coding Ursula equates drag with villainy, Ursula is again depicted as physically other, and she's a literal sea witch. So you might be asking yourself, what's the point of all of this? Well, this isn't to say that these characters aren't interesting or charming, and in fact, some of them are far more memorable and well-written than their generic and conventional heroic counterparts. The key issue here is fair representation. Because when the only characters queer kids or even adults have to look up to are the villains, it begins to feel pretty personal. While some of the examples presented can definitely be interpreted as slightly positive, the effect of seeing parts of yourself associated with evil or immorality time and time again is damaging and invalidating, especially when queer traits and influences are belittled and dehumanized to be objects of violence and evil. Furthermore, these stereotypes often pull from very superficial physical or personality traits that often perpetuate the idea that queerness can be easily defined, when in reality, queerness exists on a complex spectrum that's unique to every individual, because real people don't really fit into tropes.